story reader brings that is not borne out in medieval material is that modern readers tend to view the word ghost as meaning an incorporeal spirit, a sort of nebulous shadow, disembodied voices, poltergeists that move things without being seen. And we distinguish those very clearly from dead bodies that have supernaturally risen out of the grave and are walking around. But medieval people didn't think about things in these terms. Instead, the medieval undead exist on a spectrum of corporeality and incorporeality. They're consistently ambiguous. Ghosts that appear not to be material will suddenly turn out to be physically present in unexpected ways, and vice versa. Martha McGill, who has a great article entitled Bodies of Spirit and Air, precisely on this persistent ambiguity in medieval attitudes towards the undead, cites a great example in William of Malmesbury, where someone is speaking to a ghost. The ghost is showing him the blood, I believe it's ulcers on his hands that he's gained from his punishments in purgatory. And when the person he is talking to says, "You appear to be insubstantial," like notices that he doesn't appear to be physically there, the ghost throws a droplet of the pus from his hands at him. It strikes him in the face and burns him severely. So thinking that a ghost is insubstantial is usually a mistake in Middle English literature. And if that didn't give you an indication, there are some quite gross medieval ghosts out there. So one of the reasons why that ambiguity exists ties into medieval Christian attitudes more generally, that there was a general sense of that images and material objects the boundaries between those things could shift and blur, and this is very common, particularly in religious material. So that said, in terms of giving you a survey of what's out there in the corpus of medieval ghost stories, I thought it would be best to focus on three main questions. What do medieval ghosts look like? What do medieval ghosts want? And how should the living react to those ghosts? So, if we think about, so what do ghosts look like? And I've given you a list of some of the options that we'll see later on in the talk. If we think about ghosts as existing on a spectrum between the physical and spiritual, between the incorporeal and the corporeal, then at one end of the spectrum, we have stories in which corpses of the dead arise after burial. Now, this is sort of a specific subgenre. It's generally seen in the 11th and 12th centuries. It particularly turns up in the forms of short narratives, normally in Latin. And these appear in medieval chronicles in connections of anecdotes and collections of what we call exempla. So an exemplum is a short didactic narrative, normally written in order to illustrate a very specific moral and religious point. And they were usually written for example, for use as an example in sermons to illustrate the point of the sermon via a more engaging tale that might interest the audience. These sorts of walking dead are generally called revenants in scholarship, but they aren't called that in any of the texts. Neither Latin nor English appears to have ever developed a particular word for these. And I think that also gestures to the sense that they were ambiguous. They didn't exist as a discrete category in the way that we understand them today. Although everyone you read that writes a medieval revenant narrative will almost certainly mention how common these narratives are. So as an example, I'd like to show you, this was in the seminar reading, this is an account from a 12th century English chronicler named William of Newburgh. He describes 4 different stories about revenants, all of which are slightly different in this chronicle, but I'm going to focus particularly on this story, which is the story of the Buckingham Revenant, which is the first one he describes. We'll come back to the rest of the story a little bit later, but for now, I'd just like to focus on the initial appearance and activities of the ghost. So Newberg tells us, in these days, a wonderful event befell in the county of Buckingham. A certain man died, and according to custom, by the honourable exertion of his wife and kindred, was laid in the tomb. On the following night, however, having entered the bed where his wife was reposing, he not only terrified her by on awaking, but nearly crushed her by the insupportable weight of his body. He then goes on to continually reappear each night, but is fended off by the woman and her companions. He then begins to harass his brothers. And then when his brothers take up the similar nightly vigil, he starts to harass just everybody in the neighborhood. And when everyone in the neighborhood stays awake all through the night to stop him from attacking them, he harasses animals, apparently. But despite that, the seeming physicality of the body, the fact that he appears in all senses to be a physical person who is moving around, that he can be defended against by physical means, that his weight is the thing that is oppressive. And I think here we're looking at likely some relationship to the sorts of stories about night oppressing spirits that are basically universal on account of the phenomenon of sleep paralysis. Despite all of that, he still has some intangible aspects, because as we see at the bottom of the paragraph, having thus become a serious nuisance to his neighbors and to his friends and neighbors, he began to wander abroad in daylight, formidable indeed to all, but visible to only a few. For oftentimes on encountering a number of persons, he would appear to only one or two, though at the same time his presence was not concealed from the rest. So here we have a apparently physical corpse that is acting in very intangible ways, invisible to some people. So in addition to this, there are a number of other Revenant stories. I could have chosen many, many different examples. In addition to this, outside of this specific subgenre, there are also a lot of ghosts that just appear similar to or to be corpses, where it's really unclear whether we're talking about a physical body or if we're talking about an intangible spirit that simply takes the form of a physical body and also the substance of a physical body when it's appearing in the world. So often, these ghosts / corpses resemble a very specific artistic image that was very popular across medieval Europe. I already used an example in the title slide of the talk. This is an image called The Legend of the Three Living and the Three Dead. And it shows three people, often kings, often aristocrats, but not always. Sometimes one of them is a woman. On the left side of the picture, and then on the right side of the picture, mirroring them, three apparently walking corpses. And in this, and a lot of examples, they're accompanied by short poems that are written in the voices of the individuals in the image. You can actually see written at the top of this example, you have one of these poems. So the first king says, "I am afraid." The second one says, "Lo, what I see." The third one says, "Methinketh these be devils three." To which the dead reply, "I was well fair, thus shall thou be. For God's love, beware by me." So this is a very standard memento mori tradition, and it's also a tradition that relies very heavily on a topos that turns up in all sorts of places in medieval writings about death, which is the idea that the body of a dead person is a mirror for the living to understand their own fate, their own place in the universe, and their own sinfulness. John Merck's funeral sermon in the major English sermon collection, Merck's Festial, opens with, "Lo, here is a mirror to all Christian men, a corpse brought into the church. So it's also worth noting that the specific image is actually very stereotyped. This is a very specific sort of image of a dead person. It's a very sort of half skeletonized, very focused on thinness. And in a lot of ways, this is not a great representation of dead bodies in all sorts of different states, but it becomes the standardized means by which dead bodies are depicted in medieval art. And a lot of the ghosts that we see actively resemble them. There is a ghost in the Byland manuscript. I linked a translation of those texts in the seminar reading. One of them, one ghost is actually described as appearing as a man, man great of stature, horrible and thin, like one of the dead kings in pictures. So they were clearly using this imagery. So most of the, so sorry, I'm getting slightly lost in my script. So as well as this, as well as corpses, ghosts might appear in forms that we would liken to demons. It's often the initial reaction of a person seeing a ghost in a medieval manuscript is usually assuming they're a demon, and they're there to attack them. A good example would be the popular ghost story called The Trentle of Gregory, in which the phantom who appears is described as a wonder grisly creature, and is described as being as hideous to behold as a hell devil. There's one particularly elaborate example of this type of monstrous ghost, which I included in the seminar reading, which is the ghost that appears in a poem called The Aunteers of Arthur at the Turn Wathelin. In this story, Guinevere, King Arthur's queen, becomes lost in a forest with one of the knights of the Round Table, Sir Gawain, after the hunting party is broken up by a storm. Once they're alone, a ghost, who we later find out is Guinevere's mother, emerges from a nearby marshy lake. And I've given the description, which is one of the longest descriptions of the actual physical appearance of the ghost I'm aware of in the medieval period, in the original Middle English on the left, and in an English translation of mine on the right. And I just like to read it out, because I think the actual forcefulness of the alliterative verse here is really quite, adds a lot to the sort of sensorily overwhelming nature of the description here. Bare was the body, and black to the bone, all beclagged in clay, uncomely clad. It wearied hit waiment as a woman, but on hide ne on hue no healing it had. It stemmered, it stoned, it stood as a stone, it marred, it murmured, it mused for mad. Again the grisly ghost, Sir Gawain, is gone. He raked out at a res, for he never was drad. Drad was he never, who so right reads. On the chief of the chole, a pad's pikes on the pole, with iron holked full holler, that glowed as the gleeds. All glowed as a gleed, the ghost there ho glies, unbeclipped in a clouder of clearing unclearer, circled with serpentes about all the sides. To tell thee the toads thereon my tongue were full terror. It's personally, anyway, I think there's a very clear effort to make this as spooky as possible in the way that the verse has been put together. There's a real sense of ominous dread and doom going on in this passage. But there's also a lot going on here. It's, for one thing, it's very difficult to tell from this description whether we are looking at a body that has actually, a physical corpse, a body that has actually just come up out of the lake bed. It's all clagged with clay, smeared with mud from the ground it appears to have climbed out of. And the toads and serpents make sense for the setting because it is climbing out of a marshy lake. But at the same time, its eyes burn like coals. At one point, slightly earlier in the poem, it's described as looking like, as appearing in the likeness of Lucifer, the loathliest in hell. There's very demonic aspects to this creature. And at the same time, in a medieval context, medieval ideas of allegory allow these toads and snakes to be understood as standing in for sins. So there's a very clear sort of demonic aspect to this as well, and the poet is playing with the ambiguity of what is going on here. And I think what's going on here, and in a lot of the monstrous ghosts who appear, is that the purpose of this monstrosity is first to excite fear, and secondly, to obscure the identity of the deceased. For one thing, it reminds the viewer of their own mortality and their own sinfulness, but it also makes it impossible to immediately identify who this person is, because their identity has been hidden under this layer of monstrosity. And in a lot of ghost stories, this is a large part of the story, is you are confronted by a monstrous apparition, and the drama of the narrative is realizing who it is. So in this case, this turns out to actually be Guinevere's mother, who is here to give her spiritual advice, but she is initially presented in this extremely monstrous fashion. So, moving on. In addition to corpses and demonic entities, ghosts also sometimes appear as animals. These are both from the Byland manuscript, and they're both some of the most bizarre examples I've seen. So these are from these are from Byland manuscript ghost stories 1 and 2. In the first one, the ghost appears in the shape of a horse standing on its hind legs, and then suddenly transforms into a flying, revolving haystack with a fire in the middle. And then in the second tale, the ghost appears first as a raven with fire coming out of its sides, then later appears as a she-goat, and then finally appears again in the likeness of a man of great stature, horrible and thin, like one of the dead kings in pictures. So there's a protean aspect to these ghosts as well, that they can transform from one thing to another very easily, and in the process often appear to have physical substance. The horse ghost carries the man's beans for him. A very strange story. This isn't to say that all ghosts appear in these sorts of ways. Many of the ghosts appear as they did in life, or they appear as they did in life with some differences. Often this is in the form of, for example, the ulcerated hands, emblematic of sin. And in a lot of cases, this is doing the opposite thing to the monstrous ghosts I've described. Whereas if a ghost appears in the form if a ghost appears in the form it took in life, but injured, wounded, or burdened with, in some cases, heavy luggage, in some cases, vermin clinging to it, that is actually used as a sort of allegorical index for the sins that they committed in life. In one text, a revelation of purgatory shown to a holy woman, the ghost of a nun named Margaret, who appears horribly wounded, is able to give very eloquently a full account of what all of her injuries mean. At one point, she says that a wound over her heart from which fire is emerging is in punishment for having sworn too much by Christ's heart. And the fact she is being chased and mauled by a pair of little demonic dog and a demonic cat is punishment for the most relatable of sins, loving your pets too much. So, all that being said, there are some ghosts who also appear in the manner that we would sort of expect them to appear. This is one of the rare illustrations. There are a few illustrations that are distinctly of a specific ghost story. There are a lot of three living and three dead images. This is the only image I'm aware of which is a specific depiction of a ghost story, and it's a depiction of a ghost from a very popular narrative called The Ghast of Guy. And you might wonder which one of these people is the ghost. The answer is none of them. The ghost is invisible. It's very strange to me that they chose to illustrate this. You can see illustrator of this manuscript is grappling with the difficulty of a miracle and a marvel narrative that has at its center a visual absence. And we see this in a few lines from the poem. But of him might she have no sight, and in his chamber might she hear mickle noise and hideous beer. So this is a ghost who is visually absent, but sonically excessive. And again, it's sonically excessive in a way that can't be understood by the widow. So again, we have a situation where, like the monstrous phantoms, information is being deleted in order to make it impossible for the person who is interacting with the ghosts to immediately understand what is happening to them. So that was the first question. Second question, what do ghosts want? And this depends very heavily on where the ghost is from. So in medieval Christianity, especially towards the late period, ghosts can come from one of three places. They can come from heaven, they can come from hell, or they can come from purgatory, where dead souls are punished for a temporary span of time, although that may be thousands of years, in order to purge them of their sins and allow them entry into heaven, despite having fallen below God's standard. And depending on which three of these places a ghost hails from is likely to heavily determine its role in the narrative. Ghosts from heaven do appear very frequently in medieval literature, but I'm not going to discuss them here, mostly because generically they're very different from the other two. They mostly appear, they're usually saints, and they mostly appear essentially as agents of God's authority. They might appear as divine messengers. They might appear to give spiritual guidance or spiritual rebuking to people. They might appear in order to perform a miracle to prove God's glory, or they might appear in order to punish the wicked. But they're not really acting in the same ways as the other ghosts, so I'm going to leave them to one side. Ghosts from hell do turn up quite regularly. The first set of ghosts from hell would be the revenants, like of the kind that William of Newburgh was speaking of. It was generally suggested, although it's generally suggested that revenants rose because an exceptionally sinful man had died, and either his body had been possessed by the devil, or the evil man's soul had come back on the orders of the devil. It's not always, in many cases, the people recording these admit that they don't really know what is going on with revenants, but note that this is a common explanation. So these sorts of revenants almost exclusively appear in order to cause mayhem of various kinds, which we saw in the account of the Buckingham Revenant, or to cause sickness. In many cases, they spread very debilitating pestilence across the land, and several of Newburgh's other revenants do this. In one case, recorded by the 12th century Anglo-Welsh courtier Walter Map, the dead man goes about calling specific people in the houses in the village, and everyone whose name he calls during the night gets terribly ill and dies in short order. But apart from these revenants, the main role played by ghosts of the damned was to act as a warning towards the living. This is particularly common in those exemplar texts, those teaching and sermon texts. And the appeal of the damned ghost to that sort of writer is very obvious, because you can use a damned spirit to warn your congregation against basically any sin, whichever sin you happen to want to preach against that week. You can use a damned spirit in order to tell a story demonstrating how bad that sin is. However, by the end of the medieval period, so by the 14th, 15th century, because it should be noted that the doctrine of purgatory did not fully cohere and become fully promulgated until it wasn't promulgated as doctrine until the Council of Lyons in 1274, I believe. Although it had been circulating quite heavily in the decades before then, and built on ideas that had been current across medieval European Christianity for a long time previously. But by the end of the medieval period, so the 14th, 15th century, most ghosts are coming from purgatory. This is partly because it was generally expected that most Christian souls would end up in purgatory after they died. And spirits of purgatory could fulfill the same functions as the damned souls in terms of warning against sins. They didn't tend to cause problems, well, not in the same way. As we'll see, there are some that do cause problems. But the other major things that they came back in order to do were to ask aid from the living, and that aid usually took the form of either absolution, usually related to the revelation and correction of a crime that they'd committed in life, or to ask for prayer and charity on their behalf. And this was based on a critical element of purgatorial doctrine in the Middle Ages, which was the idea that souls in purgatory could have their suffering shortened by prayers and charity and pious acts performed by the living on their behalf, and in particular by the celebration of the Mass on their behalf. And I've included on the right an image from a Carthusian Miscellany, which I think just really is really good at illustrating how this idea was supposed to work. You can see a rope going down on the left that's being pulled on by a priest celebrating the Mass and a man giving charity and alms deeds out to the poor. And that rope goes up into heaven and has a pulley fixed in heaven, which allows the rope to pull up a bucket full of souls out of purgatory into heaven. It's a very neat little diagram of how the doctrine was conceived of as working. So this was an absolutely huge cultural complex for medieval people. You basically couldn't exist in late medieval England without being constantly inundated whenever you went to a church, and often outside of the church, with calls for prayer, reminders to pray for the dead, and reminders of the fact that you needed to secure prayer and commemoration for yourself. And this turns up in a lot of ghost stories. Very often, the main thing a ghost wants is for you to pray for it. A classic and archetypal example of this is a story called the Trental of Gregory, which basically consists of a pope. Pope Gregory is celebrating the Mass when an apparently demonic phantom enters the church. He rebukes her, at which point the supposed demon, reveals that she is actually the ghost of Gregory's mother, who is being punished and served in purgatory for sins that she committed in life and never properly made confession for. She then asks him to celebrate a very specific schedule of masses for her, which she says will release her from purgatory. She asks for 30 masses spread out over the course of the year. This is called a Trental. I'm not going to read this whole quote out. It is, but she is giving a blow-by-blow explanation of exactly how Gregory should say these masses. And they also produce, also later in the poem, I didn't include it on the slides, they also translate into English the Latin prayer, which would have been used with these sorts of Trentals. So on the one hand, it's an etiology for the Trental. It's an explanation of how the Trental came to be. But I think it's worth looking at that quote and just seeing how much space is being given to explaining this. This isn't the only text where these sorts of schedules happen. They're really quite common. This is not the most complicated one I've seen. And often these manuscripts will have notes next to the schedules saying, note these masses. And in some cases, there are texts where everything's been translated into Latin except the schedule, which they wrote out in English so that the laity could understand it. So in a lot of cases, these stories are actually perhaps best understood as paratextual apparatus around the text of the schedule of a given schedule of masses. That the story informed the audience of how they were supposed to think about these schedules and these masses and how they fit those into their world. And I won't talk about it much now, but I think what, in a lot of cases, what the value that they are adding is placing these masses in a familial context. That this is a story about a son trying to help his mother. At one point, he says, when she asks him, when he says, "Yes, I will do these masses for you," the phrase he uses is, "Thou wert my mother, I was thy son. To sing thee masses, I shall not shun." And that's just simply emotive, but it gives you a sense of the way in which this story is trying to fit the idea of the mass in telling you, what can you do with this? You can help your family. And that's what a lot of these texts are trying to do. So yes, apart from prayers, because prayers are one large category, the other large category is the other large categories are absolution, which I'm not going to talk about a huge amount in the interest of time. If people want to ask in the Q&A, feel free. Partly because it's theologically a lot muddier. And the other one is correcting negligence in commemoration. And for that, I'd like to take an example of another anecdote from Anglo-Welsh 12th century courtier Walter Map. In this narrative, Map describes a knight who dies and wills all of his goods to a priest. Said priest, in accordance with the knight's wishes, distributes all of it to the poor except for one horse, which he wants for himself, so he keeps back and doesn't distribute. The priest then appears to the knight then appears to the priest repeatedly in his dreams. And again, it should be stated here, I don't think you can easily draw a clear line between ghosts appearing in the real world and ghosts appearing in visions and dreams in the way that you might expect to in the modern day, for the same reason that visions and dreams were more material to a medieval audience than a modern audience. So he appears in the dream 3 times, asking him, please give that horse to the poor, like I asked you to. And on the 4th time, when he finds that the knight has still refused, he pronounces a very heavy judgment upon him on God's behalf. Now art thou judged, and the Lord hath hardened thy heart against repentance. And whereas thou hast trifled with his long suffering, hast not heeded warnings, and hast proudly refused honour to God, thou shalt on the 3rd day after this be caught up alive by devils into the air at the 3rd hour. The priest calls together an army to protect him from these devils, but it is of no use. There broke out a great howling in the air, and the cleric was snatched out of their hands. And on the 4th day after, he was found among the rocks 3 days' journey off, with every limb broken. So in a lot of cases, ghosts can harm you. Even purgatorial ghosts can harm you if you do the wrong thing under certain circumstances. And there are examples, I'm not going to go into it, there are examples of this motif being applied in ways that are really quite noxious and unpleasant and theologically dubious. There is a good example in the Otia Imperialia, a book of anecdotes by Gervase of Tilbury, in which, rather than having failed to do the just demands of God, a ghost returns to kill his wife for being pressured into remarriage. A highly theologically dubious proposition, I think, to any modern reader. But that is as part of a series of stories in that book that are focused on the evils of adultery and the evils of remarriage. So you can see that these ghost stories are being, oftentimes it's the way these ghost stories are compiled that is constructing meaning. So those are the things that the living want. So with all that said, how should the living respond to ghosts? Again, it really depends on where the ghost is coming from. Ghosts in hell are inherently severed from the Christian community. There is nothing that can be done for them. There is no human way to contact that which God has severed from the Christian community. At most, you can heed the warnings that they give out, and the impossibility of this sort of connection and the wrongness of this sort of hope is explained in a ghost story in the popular poem The Adulterous Falmouth Squire, in which an adulterous father begs his son not to say prayers for him, because as he is in hell, they not only do not benefit him, but they cause him greater pain, telling him, "Son, if every grass were a priest that grows on God's ground, of this pain you see me in can never make me unbound." So if the ghost is in hell, there is not much you simply have to heed the warnings that they give you. When a ghost is a revenant, possibly from hell, the question gets a little more interesting. And you do see several examples of revenant narratives, and what appears to be happening is that different social groups are arguing about the correct way to deal with a revenant. A good example of this is actually the Buckinghamshire Revenant in William of Newburgh, because as he is continually causing such a nuisance, they eventually write to their local bishop asking for help. The bishop seeks advice, having no idea what to do about this, seeks advice, and is told that there were some who said that such things had often befallen in England, and cited frequent examples to show that tranquility could not be restored until the body of this most wretched man were dug up and burnt. This is very common. Loads of revenant narratives end this way, in the same way that we might see. I mean, it's very obvious that these are cognate to, for example, sort of Central and Eastern European vampire traditions, that there's a clear similarity going on there. So it's very common for the solution to be physically, violently, permanently excluding the dead man from the Christian community by destroying their corpse. However, what's interesting in this text is that the bishop hears this and says, "No, I don't want to do that. That sounds barbaric." This proceeding appeared indecent and improper in the extreme to the Reverend Bishop, who shortly after addressed a letter of absolution written in his own hand, and commanded the tomb be opened, and the letter having been placed upon his breast to be again closed, and he was thenceforth never more seen to wander, nor permitted to inflict annoyance or terror upon anyone. And so you see here, I think, an example of the church reacting against this sort of superstition, the church declaring a particular point about how one is to deal with these revenants. It opens the question of whether this individual was in hell at all, because how can you absolve someone who has been sent to hell? At the same time, there are other stories. There's a story in Walter Map. I should also mention Map is a satirist. He is generally accepted to be writing in a comic manner. But Map has an example of this in which almost the reverse happens. A bishop organizes something, it doesn't work, and then the stalwart English knight who asked the bishop to handle it has to kill the revenant with a sword. And that at the same time is satirizing the same sort of tension regarding who has the power to deal with and make judgments about the dead. That question, who has the right to engage with the dead, is a huge one in terms of ghost stories and what they meant for the people who were reading them. So enough of the hell, but this is also a serious question with regards to ghosts from purgatory. because there's only really one appropriate answer to a ghost from purgatory, and it is to help it. Ghosts from purgatory tend to cause problems until someone agrees to help them when they do cause problems. They either just ask and someone helps them, or they cause problems until someone helps them. So the only real solution to a ghost from purgatory is to accede to their requests and to help them. And this is again an indication of the fact that the dead in purgatory are conceived as still being in community. They are still Christians, they are still subjects of charity, and it's your duty to assist them. But the question then becomes, who has the right? Who has the right and the expertise to take ownership of the process of aiding the dead? And this wasn't a hypothetical question, because you might not have ghosts appearing, but people were constantly arranging prayers and arranging masses for dead people in their communities. So the question of who has ownership of that process, the tension and paradox of the relationship between the laity, who want to believe they have control of that process, and the church, who also want to maintain the idea that they have control over that process, is a real tension within that society. And it's one that the ghost stories often look into, and it comes up in a lot of ways. Like I said, this is one of the elements of the story of the Trential of Gregory, is that it is about placing commemorative prayer within a familial context, and particularly lay familial context. That it's a context in which the laity, who are more likely to have to spend a lot of time in purgatory than the religious and the priesthood, for simple reasons of what they were doing in their lives, begin to see their children, and the fact that their children and their loved ones and the people around them will pray for them, as a way of balancing their spiritual books. And a lot of these stories contain a really strong element of validation of lay relationships, of one's relationships with their children, of one's relationships with their spouses, and fix upon the idea that God, through the construct of purgatorial doctrine, that God is validating and honoring those types of relationships that really, really mattered to people. And I'm just going to give one example. This is the main subject of my thesis, so I could ramble on forever, but I will give one example, and it's from the account of the invisible poltergeist that we discussed right near the beginning, the Ghast of Guy, because again, that's an invisible spirit that is tormenting his widow and making monstrous noises that the widow cannot understand. And it's not until the widow fetches a priest and the priest says a specific series of liturgical formula that the ghost begins to speak in an understandable manner. There is then a lengthy disputation with the ghost where they discuss various things. And the ghost eventually explains that he is being punished for a sin he committed with his wife in their bedroom, but he won't tell you what it is. The priest then begins trying to interrogate him, and not only does the ghost refuse to answer any of the priest's questions about the sins his wife committed, because he's not required to explain this to the priest, because he and his wife have both adequately confessed the sin. He also rejects the priest's suggestion that it would have been easier for him to go to the priests to begin with. Rejects the idea that he should have ignored his wife. And we get here, and I'll read it in the modern English. And the prior then began to ask him why he had not come at that time unto men of religion, for to tell them of his life more readily than unto his wife, since that the prior knew that they were more near to God than any woman were, and they could understand him better. The voice answered then and said, I loved more my wife than any other man in life, and therefore first to her I went. And then he explains that when God pronounced his judgment upon him, he asked God, can I haunt my wife? So that the punishment that, because this was it was generally understood that whatever penance or punishment one suffered in life was, logarithmically less than what one would suffer after death in purgatory. So he asks God, can I go and haunt my wife so that she doesn't suffer the same way I'm having to suffer? And the important point is that God says yes. That was not, they make clear actually God has another reason for the haunting, but that when he says, can I do this in order to benefit my wife, God says yes. And a lot of these texts, I think, are saying essentially that that they are trying to reorient the sort of the cultural complex around commemorative prayer in the Middle Ages to focus on the relationships that really mattered to them, and to use it as a way of getting divine support for those relationships. And I could ramble on forever, but I think we should move on to the Q&A. So thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed the talk.
Thank you so much, James. That was fantastic. You've got lots of Zoom claps that you can, of course, see rather than hear. There's also lots of things in the chat, mostly me and Katrina picking up on some of your wonderful quotes. A lot of us really liked the bucket full of souls. That's probably
yes, it's a good bucket. It's